Well, I want to thank you for having me as your guest minister this morning. When I received the invitation to come back, I had to go back into my records because I couldn't remember exactly when I had been with you last. And it was soon after I came back to Virginia from being in Boston. I had been there for 7 years, both attending divinity school and parish ministry. And that was during the time that began to develop a connection with UU churches, because as y'all are aware, that's the seat of UUism. There are UU churches on every corner of Boston, and I was very fortunate to develop friendships with UU ministers in Boston. So when I unexpectedly came back to Virginia, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to stay active in ministry, but several of my colleagues from Boston suggested that I get in touch with UU churches in Virginia and see if they had any openings, and fortunately they did, and one of the first ones that I did in the fall of 2013 was with you here on the peninsula, and after that it has expanded, and I have had the privilege of speaking at multiple UU churches throughout Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Having grown up here in southeastern Virginia, however, my experience based on my topic of spiritual but not religious, that was a path for me to follow in many ways of my path for ministry, because growing up in southeastern Virginia, it was very much in the tradition that is so prevalent in southeastern Virginia. My neighbors, our family, our friends, the people with whom I went to school, we were a very fundamentalist, evangelical, Christian expression of faith. And within that tradition, there was not a mention of spiritual practices. If there were, I honestly have thought about it, and I do not remember there being a discussion or referencing specific spiritual practices. The closest that I can remember were particular faith practices, and they were always prayer and fasting. And you prayed and you fasted for two reasons. Number one, you specifically wanted something from God. And a devoted time of prayer, coupled with your determination to deprive yourself of nourishment during this time, would somehow convince God to grant the request you were seeking. And the other reason you did prayer and fasting was because you had committed some sort of heinous sin, and this was the only way to get God's forgiveness, to show God you were so serious about being repentant for you that if you prayed enough and said the right prayers and fasted, that God would eventually say, yes, I can see that you're sincerely sorry and I'll forgive you. But those were as close as I ever came to anything that we consider spiritual practices. They weren't part of my existence, part of my faith background. So when I became involved in the MCC, which I am now, and for those of you who may not be familiar with MCC, MCC is Metropolitan Community Church. We were founded in 1968 as the first Christian denomination with a specific ministry to the LGBT community. And although we're open to everyone, that has been the focus of our denomination's ministry. And we've been very fortunate since our founding. We've often worked with UU churches and other open and affirming and welcoming congregations. But when I entered MCC, that was when I began to experience people from other faith backgrounds who had spiritual practices, some of which I was somewhat familiar with, others I had never encountered. And then when I began to go to divinity school, I was very fortunate for the internet, because all of our classes had a component where we were supposed to develop a spiritual practice based on the theme of the class. And that wasn't something that was easy for me to do, because this wasn't part of my background. This wasn't part of what I practiced, part of my faith, part of anything that I was familiar with. And I should be, I hope that my divinity school doesn't ask for my degree back in saying this. It was really a borrowing experience. Not that I plagiarized, but I borrowed elements from other traditions just because it was not something that I was familiar with. And I recognize why the Divinity School required this practice, because it was to help in later ministry to develop this idea of helping people to whom you minister develop their spiritual practices. But for other people, it was very easy. They would have bells and whistles and incense and sand and pebbles and water and flowers, and were very impressive with the spiritual practices they developed around the theme of the class. I was just the opposite. I struggled with it, and if I came up with a candle and maybe a stick of incense, I was really working on all cylinders were pumping at that point. And I've often wondered, maybe that's part of why my unfamiliarity with certain spiritual practices may be why they're not quite as meaningful to me in my faith practice as they might be for other people. But I've embraced them, and I've tried them throughout my faith existence. But there's just something I don't quite connect with in the way that other people do. That isn't to say I don't encourage other people to follow their faith practices, but they don't always ring as true for my spiritual existence as they are for other individuals. And it's one of the many questions during the time that I've been here in Virginia, which for the 2 years I've been here, it's been a time of intentional discernment for me, not discernment whether or not I wanted to stay in ministry or leave ministry. That was never a question. It was a time of discernment. What is my ministry at the end of this period going to be? What is it going to resemble? And one of the questions I'm frequently asked by my superiors in my denomination is, what are my spiritual practices? And unfortunately, I don't always give them the answer they want, and I sometimes wonder if they think I'm being flippant with them, but I'm actually not, because my spiritual practices, well, if I take a walk early in the morning, for me, that's a spiritual practice, as much as it is an exercise. If I watch a certain television program, that for me can be a spiritual practice. And of course, I'm not referring to the latest episode of Honey Boo Boo. That's not what I mean. But I think we're all aware that there are television programs that have an artistic quality that's such that when we watch them, or the particular message of the show, it has somehow spoken to us in such a way that we want to record it. We want to see it again. We want to share it with other people. We feel uplifted by the message of it. I remember once hearing someone describe viewing a television program several times, and this was actually someone who had been in a popular television program, and he was asked about reruns. And he said on the wall of his home, he had several works of art by great masters. And he said when he walked by them, he didn't just look at the painting one time and said, well, that's a nice painting, and then never look at it again. And he said he felt like some of the shows that he was involved with were the same way, that he wasn't comparing the quality of his TV program with a great master, but at the same time, he felt like you just didn't watch it one time and never see it again. You continued to get new things out of it. But when I told my superiors in my denomination that my spiritual practices were spending time with my family, spending time with my pet, spending time with friends were as much important to me as if I were embracing burning incense while I was praying, or praying specific prayers within a book of prayer, or having an altar where there were pictures of saints or Christ in which I prayed and practiced meditation. I don't know that that's always the answer they were looking for. So that's why I sometimes think they may have thought I was being flippant in my answers, but I really wasn't. Part of what I'm very grateful for over the past 2 years has been the time that I have spent in UU churches. Until I moved to Boston and began Divinity School and then later served a parish there, I wasn't really familiar with the UU denomination or what your faith practices were or how your expression of faith was expressed, and I knew very little. The only church that I was familiar with was the Unitarian Church in Norfolk, because I grew up in Norfolk, and really knew nothing about them. I had always been told in the faith tradition in which I grew up, which was fundamentalist and evangelical, well, the Unitarians, you stay away from them because they don't believe in the Bible and they don't believe in Jesus. And as you know, that's not quite exactly expresses the UU faith, but that was all I knew. I never knew anything different. And so it was a surprise to me as I became more fully acquainted with UU churches and congregations, the depth of spirituality of so many of the members, expressed in so many different ways. So during my time in Virginia, as I received invitations to be a guest minister, I really thought about it before I engaged the first time, because in my faith tradition, I'm so used to developing a message based on elements of Christianity. I'm used to doing it in such a way that I could select certain verses from either the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian scriptures. I could refer to certain points in Christian history. I could use phrases or terminology that the congregation would instantly know what I was referring to. And as I look back on it, as I was preparing messages for UU congregations, I realized that in some ways I had become something of a lazy minister by doing that. Because it was really easy just to put a message together depending upon those elements. And even if I wasn't doing it intentionally to be lazy, it was still too easy. It was becoming too easy for me to develop a message, that it wasn't challenging me. So when I began to develop messages for UU congregations, I really wanted to be, as part of my Southern heritage, I wanted to be a good guest as much as the churches invited me wanted to be a good host. And I was never told that anything other than I always had freedom of the pulpit. But at the same time, I felt like that I wanted to walk the journey with you as a congregation, as opposed to preparing a message that I would traditionally preach in a Christian church. So it inspired me to work harder in developing my messages. I began to have to not rely on the tools I did in the past. I couldn't open a Bible and pick out a verse and develop a 20-minute message as I would in a Christian church. I had to search out readings or poems or specific topics that I was asked to speak on that challenged me. And I really feel like that worked in my advantage, although to begin with I didn't realize that. But having been through 2 years of discernment, I feel like that the time I've spent with so many UU congregations in Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, that it helped define my ministry and who I am as a minister more so than if I'd have stayed for the past 2 years in parish ministry. And I know at this point it sounds like I'm going off into the realm of metaphysical, but at the same time, I truly believe there was some universal design to my being in Virginia for this time period and having this experience, because I feel like coming out of this 2-year experience, I'm a better minister now than I was when I started. And part of the reason for that is in my developing messages for UU congregations, I began to realize that a lot of the terminology we depend on in more Christian-centric faiths unintentionally can nonetheless be segregational, in that people visiting, if they don't come from that background, may not know what we're referring to, may not understand the phrases we're using. And I don't know if we're always aware of that. I don't know if we always appreciate how our language and how we express our faith can probably, for some people, be a little bit off-putting. Why we're doing certain things, why we're doing them because we don't take the time to explain that in our services. The other thing that happened during the past 2 years as I was becoming involved with UU congregations for different reasons and various circumstances, I began to receive invitations to officiate weddings and memorial services and funerals, especially occasionally for the past year, especially from the Unitarian Church in Norfolk, because their circumstances, they haven't had a minister, and I live within about 20 minutes of the church. So I was asked multiple times when a UU minister wasn't available, could I come and officiate a wedding or a funeral or a memorial service? And I was more than happy to do so. The difficulty for me was, or I should say the challenge, not the difficulty for me, was how to do officiate a wedding or a memorial service outside of my faith tradition. Because in the same way that my messages that I developed for UU congregations weren't necessarily a reflection of my faith background, the same way a wedding or funeral or memorial service was not my wedding or my funeral or my memorial service. So how did I develop this for these particular couples? And they would use phrases which may have known in passing, but not really certain what they meant, and I would be asked to officiate a humanist wedding, or a couple that asked me to officiate a wedding for them, and they described themselves as being a spiritual humanist, and I wasn't sure what that meant, and I had to figure out in conversation with them exactly what it was that practice meant, and that was where I got the title of my message, Spiritual But Not Religious, was from that couple, because they described to me their life and their belief system and their connection with a power outside themselves that they did not necessarily identify as a God power, but nonetheless recognized something outside themselves was greater, and that was the spiritual component. And then I was most especially challenged when I received an invitation to officiate a memorial service for someone who was self-described as both pagan and Wiccan. And that was so far outside my wheelhouse of expertise. That was not something I learned in a Christian divinity school. But I was very grateful to be part of that, because for me, being there with them and sharing that experience with them, I felt not only honored to do so, it became a spiritual practice for me. Because as I developed this service for them and worked with the family to develop the service, instead of seeing our differences, I began to see how many elements we had in common, but in many ways simply expressed in different terms. So my experience has been the past 2 years here in Virginia, one of working closely with UU congregations, but in such a way that it has helped define me as a minister and what my ministry will look like in the future. And when I'm asked now to define my ministry and who I am as a minister, I tell people that as opposed to the past, and although I wasn't a person who did this in traditional sense, I'm not a minister who proselytizes, but I am a minister who walks with you in your journey. I really understand the concept of a ministry of presence far more than I did in the past. My job is not to, in my particular expression of ministry, is not to convince someone to see things the way I do, but is instead now to encourage people on their path and help them in finding whatever expression of path they choose to follow that's best for them. That would have not happened 2 years ago. I would have never described myself in those terms. And that's part of why I'm so grateful for the experience of being invited back here, and not only here, but the other UU churches I've been invited to in Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. I'm not sure how this will play out as I now approach the process of returning to parish ministry in my denomination, because most of our churches, except for a few examples which are very much more progressive leaning in places on the West Coast and in a few other locations, are much more traditional Christian-centric expressions of worship. So I'm not quite sure how I'll be placed now. But at the same time, when I still receive invitations for more Christian traditional places of worship, I still will develop my message along the same lines as I do if I'm speaking to a UU congregation, because their faith tradition is a certain expression, and I develop my message to coincide with their beliefs as opposed to come in and preaching my beliefs to them. So it's not that if I am placed in a particular MCC congregation, I wouldn't know how to speak to them anymore. I do think, though, that they may be surprised by some of my messages. They won't be quite the Christian message that they may have been used to hearing or hearing in the past, but that's a good thing. One of my friends who's a UU minister frequently uses the expression, and I may not get this exactly right, we're to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And I think in many of the churches in my faith tradition, we are very comfortable. And we need to be a little bit of prodding, a little bit of thinking about in our day, in our society, in our culture, especially as it's evolving and changing, how do we connect with those who may not be familiar with our particular expression of faith? So again, I thank you for inviting me. I thank you for having me. I hope before my time in Virginia is up, I may have the chance to reconnect with you all again. But it's been a blessing being here. Thank you.